They say history forgets the silent ones. But this time we will remember her. Because her story didn't begin in power. It began in silence. Atlanta woke up that morning to a storm. Not of rain or thunder, but of chaos. Inside the tall glass tower of Halden Technologies, panic had a sound. The relentless beeping of failed servers, the hurried footsteps of engineers, and the hollow echo of fear running down every floor. It was supposed to be their greatest day. The company was moments away from launching a global platform that promised to change how the world connected. But at exactly 9:17 a.m., every screen went dark. The system had crashed. In a single instant, millions of dollars vanished into digital smoke. The CEO, Richard Halden, stood frozen at the edge of his office window, staring down at the city below. A city built on movement, now paralyzed by silence. He was a man used to control, to solutions, to answers. But that morning, even his best minds had none. Get the backup servers online. Restart the grid. Trace the source. Commands filled the air like desperate prayers. Yet the lights on every monitor stayed red. Unresponsive, mocking. And while the powerful scrambled, somewhere on the 32nd floor, a woman in a faded uniform quietly emptied a trash bin. Her name was Lydia Parker. To most, she was invisible, the maid who smiled, nodded, and disappeared before anyone remembered she was there. But Lydia had something that no one in that building had: patience. Years of it. Patience born from struggle, from single motherhood, from dreams she never got to chase. That morning, she moved quietly from office to office, her worn shoes squeaking on polished tiles, while chaos erupted around her. And sitting by the hallway window, waiting for her mother to finish work, was a young girl with a small backpack and an oversized hoodie. Her name was Amara, 16. Sharp eyes, a calm face that hid a storm of curiosity. She wasn't supposed to be there. School was out, and Lydia couldn't leave her home alone that week. So she brought her to work, just for a few hours. Amara sat near the vending machine, her tablet glowing faintly in her hands. While everyone panicked about systems and networks, she was quietly writing lines of code, her own little world of numbers and logic. She didn't understand the full extent of what was happening. Not yet. But she could feel it. The fear, the frustration, the hopelessness. Thick in the air. Even from afar, she could see the CEO pacing like a caged animal behind the glass walls of his office. Lydia noticed too. She whispered under her breath, "Lord, help them." Hours passed, and the situation only grew worse. The engineers argued, the investors called nonstop, and the news had already begun to spread. Halden Technologies, the company that promised the future, had fallen to a standstill. Some said it was a cyber attack. Others blamed the new AI integration. No one had answers. And in that storm of confusion, no one noticed the young girl watching the error logs flicker on the main display screen. Her mind began to turn, piecing together fragments, patterns. Something about it looked familiar. But she said nothing. Because in places like that, people like her were taught to stay quiet. By nightfall, most of the staff had given up. The CEO sat in his dark office, tie loosened, staring blankly at a silent monitor. He had built his empire on perfection, and now it had collapsed right before his eyes. The janitorial staff worked late that night. Lydia hummed softly as she wiped down desks, trying not to disturb the silence. Amara sat nearby, pretending to do homework, but her eyes kept glancing at the reflection of the monitor screens. Something in her heart whispered, "I could fix that." But she didn't say a word. Not yet. Because sometimes history waits. And sometimes destiny tests how long silence can hold before it turns into a voice that changes everything. They say history forgets the silent ones. But this time, history was watching her. They say some lives pass by unnoticed. Not because they lack worth, but because the world never bothered to look close enough. Long before that system crashed, Lydia Parker had already learned how to survive in silence. For 14 years, She had cleaned the offices of Halden Technologies. Floors shining, desks spotless, glass walls polished until the city lights reflected like stars. Every night she left behind a building ready for the morning's rush. Yet no one ever remembered who made it that way. They called her Miss Parker when they needed something, and the cleaning lady when they didn't. But she never complained. She was grateful. Grateful for the paycheck that kept food on the table, for the old apartment in the south side of Atlanta, for her daughter's laughter that still filled their little world with light. Lydia had once dreamed of studying architecture. She loved the way buildings rose from nothing, how a few lines on paper could become something grand and lasting. But dreams like that were fragile things, too expensive to keep when life turned hard. Her husband, Marcus, had been a mechanic, good hands, warm smile, until an accident at the garage took him away when Amara was just 10. Since then, Lydia had worked twice as hard and smiled twice as often to hide the cracks in her spirit. And Amara, she was everything her mother could no longer be. Quiet, observant, curious about everything. While other children spent their evenings scrolling through videos, Amara spent hers watching coding tutorials on an old tablet that flickered every few minutes. She didn't have expensive equipment or teachers, just a small library card and determination that burned like a hidden fire. At school, the teachers didn't quite know what to make of her. Too quiet, too quick, too different. She'd fix broken classroom laptops before the IT guy even showed up. But even then, few paid attention. Because sometimes, brilliance looks too ordinary to be noticed. It's a strange thing, how society sees worth. They measure it in titles, in suits, in offices with windows. They never look for it in the eyes of a girl wearing hand-me-down sneakers. Every evening, Lydia would come home tired but smiling, her hands raw from cleaning chemicals, her knees aching from bending too long. And Amara would be there, with tea ready and a new piece of code she wanted to show her mom. "Look, Mama, it's a game I made," she'd say, showing a tiny program that made a smiley face move across the screen. Lydia would laugh softly. "That's beautiful, baby. You're gonna build something real big one day." She said it every time like a prayer. The next morning after the crash, Lydia woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. The company had called. Everyone was to report early. No one knew when they'd be going home. When Lydia and Amara arrived, the building felt different. No music in the lobby, no laughter from the marketing floor, just fear hanging in the air like fog. Amara sat quietly in the hallway again, her backpack beside her. She could hear the muffled arguments from behind closed doors, engineers speaking in half sentences, the CEO shouting for answers that didn't exist. And yet no one noticed her. The young girl with the curious eyes, the one who could already read half the code flashing on the lobby screens. She was invisible, just like her mother. But the thing about invisible people is that they see everything. They listen, they observe, and one day, they surprise the world that forgot to see them. That afternoon, one of the engineers, a tired young man with coffee stains on his shirt, dropped a stack of printed code beside the trash can. Amara watched as the papers slid to the floor, lines of numbers and commands scattering like fallen words. When no one was looking, she quietly picked them up. Her fingers traced the symbols' logic, syntax, and structure, like poetry. Something about it felt wrong. A missing bracket, a misplaced loop. It wasn't much, but to her it stood out like a red flag. She wanted to tell someone, but who would listen to a maid's daughter? So she folded the papers carefully, slid them into her backpack, and said nothing. That night, as Lydia and Amara walked home under the dim orange glow of the streetlights, Amara asked softly, "Mama, what happens if they can't fix it?" Lydia sighed. "Then the big folks lose some money, baby, and we just keep cleaning tomorrow." But Amara looked ahead, her eyes thoughtful. What if someone else could fix it? Lydia smiled at her in that tired, knowing way only mothers do. Then the world would have to open its eyes, wouldn't it? They didn't know it yet, But that night, the world was already turning toward them. Because sometimes, destiny doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes, it waits in the quiet corners, where the invisible ones are learning how to shine. They say some lives pass by unnoticed, but not hers. Not this time. The world just didn't know her name yet. Amara Parker. They say every empire falls the same way. First with arrogance, then with fear, and finally with silence. 3 days had passed since the crash, and Halden Technologies was unraveling like an old thread. What once looked like a fortress of innovation now felt like a sinking ship. The walls that had echoed with confidence were now filled with whispers of doubt and blame. On the upper floors, men in tailored suits debated whose fault it was. On the lower floors, engineers worked without sleep, eyes red, hands trembling over keyboards that refused to obey. And somewhere in between, Lydia Parker quietly mopped the marble hallways, watching the storm from a distance. The CEO, Richard Halden, hadn't left the building in 72 hours. His crisp suits were replaced with wrinkled shirts and a face lined with exhaustion. He had built his reputation on control, on being the man who always had answers. But this time there were none. Every fix failed. Every backup was corrupted. Even the cybersecurity firm he called from New York had no clue how to restore what had been lost. For all their brilliance, all their education and money, no one could find the pulse of the machine they had created. By noon, the company's investors demanded an update. The video call was brief and brutal. One of them said, "Richard, if you don't get it running by the end of the week, we're pulling out." Another added, "You built your empire on promises. Now it's time to keep one." After the call, Richard stood in his office, staring at the reflection of the city in his window. The skyline looked cold, distant, and mocking. He whispered to himself, "How did it all fall apart?" But the city didn't answer. It never does. Meanwhile, on the 32nd floor, Amara sat quietly with her mother. Lydia had been asked to stay late again, cleaning up after endless meetings and coffee spills. The staff barely noticed her presence anymore. They were too lost in panic. Amara sat near a corner, her backpack open. The same stack of printed code she had found earlier spread across her lap. Her fingers traced each line slowly. She wasn't an expert, at least not by their definition, but logic was a language she spoke fluently. Something about the loop function still bothered her. A misfire, a recursive call that shouldn't have existed. It looked like a small mistake, but she knew better. Sometimes the smallest line breaks the biggest systems. She glanced toward the glass conference room where the engineers argued. She wanted to walk in there, point to the code, and say, "You're looking in the wrong place." But she didn't, because she was 16, because she was a maid's daughter, because the world had told her over and over that some voices just weren't meant to be heard. It's a strange kind of pain, knowing you have the answer, but no one will listen. Lydia noticed her staring and gently touched her shoulder. "Baby, don't get caught up in their mess. It ain't our business." Amara hesitated. "But what if? I can help." Her mother gave a tired smile. "You've got a beautiful mind, Amara. But those people, they ain't ready to see it yet." Silence lingered between them, soft, heavy, and familiar. Amara looked down at the code again, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythm of her thoughts. She didn't know it, but destiny was already whispering her name. Later that evening, the CEO called for one final meeting. Every team lead gathered in the boardroom, pale faces under harsh fluorescent light. The head of engineering delivered the verdict no one wanted to hear. "We can't fix it, sir. We've tried everything. The mainframe's gone. There's no way to rebuild it from scratch in time." The room went silent. For a long moment, Richard Halden didn't move. Then, slowly, he said, "Everyone go home." No one argued. Chairs scraped, footsteps faded, and the building grew quiet again. Lydia watched the engineers leave, broken, defeated. She could feel their despair like static in the air. Amara sat by the window, still holding those papers, her face half lit by the city lights outside. And as Lydia finished cleaning the empty conference room, Richard Halden walked past her. He didn't even notice the maid or the girl by the window. He just kept walking down the corridor into the elevator into the night, carrying with him the weight of failure. But if he had looked back, just once, he might have seen the faint glow of a tablet screen and a pair of determined brown eyes scanning lines of code faster than anyone in his company could. They say every empire falls the same way, but they rarely tell you what happens after, when a quiet storm begins to rise from the places no one ever looked. That night, in the humblest corner of the grandest building, a miracle was beginning to take shape, one line of code at a time. They say some voices echo louder in silence than in sound, but only if the world stops long enough to listen. The next morning came quietly. Atlanta's skyline shimmered under a pale sunrise, but inside Halden Technologies, hope was gone. The once bustling offices now felt hollow. Rows of dark monitors, half-empty coffee cups, and people moving without purpose. Lydia Parker arrived early, as always. She didn't expect much. Just another long day of cleaning after another long night of panic. But when she walked in, she noticed something different about her daughter. Amara sat in the lobby, her tablet glowing softly in her hands, eyes fixed on the screen like someone tracing the edge of a secret. Her fingers moved fast, deliberate, sure. "Baby," Lydia whispered, setting her cleaning bag down. "What are you doing?" Amara didn't look up. "Just testing something." For the last 2 nights, she hadn't slept much. The code she had taken home haunted her like a song stuck in her head, a melody that refused to end until the missing note was found. And finally, she'd found it. It was simple, a single line of misdirected command that looped the mainframe into itself, freezing every function behind a wall of data redundancy. To fix it, you didn't need power. You didn't need money. You just needed to see it differently. But how could she tell anyone? No one would believe a 16-year-old, especially one who wasn't even supposed to be in the building. Sometimes the hardest part of genius is not the discovery. It's the courage to speak it aloud. Hours passed. Executives drifted in and out. The CEO returned, looking like a man aged by a lifetime in 1 week. The company was hanging by a thread, and the air smelled of defeat. That's when it happened. An engineer, the same one who had dropped those papers days ago, stormed out of the server room, tossing his notebook on a chair. "It's over," he muttered. "Even the recovery module's corrupted. We're done." His words carried across the room, landing like a final nail in a coffin. Amara's head lifted. Her eyes narrowed. That word recovery sparked something. She opened her tablet again, comparing the code she'd saved to the pattern she'd memorized from the error logs. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's not corrupted. It's looping." Richard Halden, walking past, caught her voice. Just a few quiet words from a young girl sitting by the window. He stopped, turned. "What did you just say?" Lydia froze. "Sir, I'm so sorry, she didn't mean." But Amara stood up, clutching her tablet. Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I said it's looping. The recovery module isn't broken. It's trapped in its own command." The room went silent. One of the engineers chuckled under his breath. "That's cute, kid. But this isn't a video game." Amara looked straight at him. "No, but your log file is calling itself. You're chasing ghosts instead of fixing the root." The laughter stopped. Halden frowned. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said quietly. "Amara Parker. And you think you can fix what my entire team couldn't?" Amara hesitated, glancing at her mother, who shook her head slightly. But then she lifted her chin. "I don't think, sir. I know where to start." It was the kind of courage that doesn't come from pride, but from truth. The courage of someone who's been invisible too long. The CEO stared at her for a moment. A young girl in worn sneakers and a faded hoodie, standing among professionals with badges and titles. He should have dismissed her. He should have walked away. But something in her eyes, steady, unshaken, made him pause. "All right," he said finally. "You've got 5 minutes. Show me." The engineers exchanged glances. Disbelief, irritation, even mockery. Lydia's hands trembled as she whispered, "Amara, please." But her daughter had already stepped forward. Inside the glass-walled conference room, Amara placed her tablet on the table and connected it to the network display. Her hands moved swiftly, typing, scrolling, analyzing. The room filled with the sound of clicking keys and shallow breaths. She pointed at a block of code on the large screen. "There," she said. "That's your loop. Line 2467 calls back to the old integration script. Every time you reboot, it relocks itself. You're not restarting. You're resetting the problem." The lead engineer frowned. "That can't be right, we." "Try it," she said softly. And for the first time, they did. A silence deeper than fear settled over the room as the command line executed. The system paused, flickered. Then, like a breath being drawn after drowning, the network lights turned green. The server came alive. Monitors across the building blinked back to life. And the impossible had just happened. Richard Halden stood frozen. No words, no movement, just disbelief. His empire, resurrected by the daughter of a maid. Some moments are so silent that even time stops to listen. This was one of them. Lydia stood outside the glass, tears in her eyes, hands pressed to her chest. Her daughter, the child she'd raised on hope and hard days, had done what no one else could. And in that silence, something far greater than a system rebooted. Respect, recognition, humanity. They say some voices are never heard. But on that day, one voice rose above the noise, soft, brave, and unforgettable. They say miracles don't just happen. They're made piece by piece, by the hands of those who never stopped believing they could. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the servers filled the silence like a heartbeat returning to life. Monitors that had glowed red for days now pulsed with green, steady and alive. On every floor, lights blinked, systems rebooted, and files once thought lost reappeared as if summoned from the edge of oblivion. The miracle was real, and it had come from the smallest, quietest corner of the room. Amara Parker stood there, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard, her reflection trembling in the glass wall before her. Behind her, a dozen engineers stared in disbelief. Some mouths hung open, some eyes narrowed, confusion mixed with pride and shame. Lydia Parker stood frozen outside the conference room door, her mop leaning against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter, the same girl she'd raised on hope and humble beginnings, had just done the impossible. Richard Halden finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Run a full diagnostic." The lead engineer scrambled to the terminal. "Sir, it's stable. Everything's back online. Even the corrupted data, it's clean." Halden looked at the girl again. How did you know?" Amara took a breath. "It wasn't complicated. You just weren't looking at the right loop." Her tone wasn't arrogant. It was gentle, matter-of-fact, like someone explaining a song they'd heard by heart. Sometimes genius sounds less like a lecture and more like truth spoken softly. The CEO turned toward the glass wall, staring out at the city below. The skyline now bright again, screens on the nearby buildings flickering with life. He felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Humility. In all his years of building companies and commanding brilliance, he had never once imagined salvation would come from a 16-year-old girl waiting for her mother to finish cleaning. When he finally spoke, his words trembled with awe. "What's your name again?" "Amara Parker," she said quietly. He nodded slowly. "Well, Miss Parker, you just saved this company." Word spread faster than the crash itself. By noon, every department knew. By evening, the story had reached the investors. And by nightfall, whispers filled the internet. about the young black girl who had done what no professional could. The next morning, reporters waited outside the glass tower of Halden Technologies. Cameras flashed, headlines bloomed, and the world wanted to know one thing. Who was she? Lydia tried to shield her daughter from the noise, but there was no hiding from it anymore. She stood beside Amara in the lobby, holding her hand tightly as microphones and lights surrounded them. A journalist asked, "How did it feel, fixing something the experts couldn't?" Amara smiled shyly. "It wasn't about being smarter. I just wanted to help." In a world obsessed with status, her answer was disarming. Because real wisdom never needs to prove itself, it just shines. Inside his office, Richard Halden watched the coverage unfold on television. For the first time in days, he smiled. He called Lydia and Amara into the boardroom that afternoon. When they arrived, the staff stood, not out of habit, but out of respect. Halden extended his hand to Amara. "You've done more than save a company. You've reminded us what it means to listen." He turned to Lydia. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. All these years, I've walked past you without seeing you. But today, the world saw both of you." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed steady. "Thank you, sir. But you don't owe me anything. Just see her for who she is." Halden nodded. "I do. And I intend to." That day, he made a promise. The company would sponsor Amara's education in full, every expense, every opportunity. And Lydia Parker would never have to clean another floor again. It was a promise born not from guilt, but from gratitude, the kind that humbles even the proudest hearts. That night, as the city lights shimmered outside their apartment window, Lydia sat at the kitchen table, watching her daughter type away on her old tablet. "Still working?" she asked softly. Amara smiled. "Just adding something. Another fix?" "No," Amara said, looking up. "A dream." Lydia chuckled. "What kind of dream?" Amara turned the screen to her mother. On it was the name of a new program, the Parker Initiative, a project she'd started to teach coding to kids who didn't have access to computers. Her voice carried quiet determination. "If the world didn't see me, Mama, maybe it'll see them." Lydia reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "Baby," she whispered, "the world already sees you. They say miracles don't just happen. But maybe they do when a mother believes, when a daughter dares, and when a world finally learns to listen. They say every genius is born from struggle, but sometimes it's not the mind that's brilliant, it's the heart that refuses to break." Long before Amara Parker became the name on every headline, she was just a little girl sitting at a cracked kitchen table in the south side of Chicago, surrounded by the soft hum of an old laptop her mother had rescued from a trash pile. The computer barely worked, flickered, froze, and hissed every few minutes. But to Amara it was magic. Lydia would watch her from across the room, wringing her hands after long shifts cleaning offices downtown. "Baby, that thing's about to fall apart," she'd warn. Amara would grin without looking up. "Then I'll fix it." That was her gift. Not genius for the sake of pride, but curiosity born from necessity. They didn't have much. Some weeks, dinner was rice and hope. But every night, when the city outside fell asleep, Amara's room glowed with the pale light of her screen, lines of code scrolling like poetry. She didn't learn from textbooks or teachers. She learned from trial, error, and persistence. Every crash, every error message, a lesson. Every fix, a victory. When she was 10, her father, Elijah Parker, passed away. He'd been a mechanic, a man with grease-stained hands and a heart full of dreams. He used to tell her, "Machines speak, baby. You just gotta learn to listen." She never forgot that. So while other kids played games, Amara broke them apart, not out of defiance but out of fascination. She wanted to know how things worked and, more importantly, why they failed. Somewhere between loss and longing, she found language in logic and purpose in persistence. Years later, When Lydia started working at Halden Technologies, she'd often come home with stories about the big boss, the fancy building, and the shiny computers. Amara would listen quietly, picturing it all. The glass towers, the people in suits, the hum of power she'd never felt before. One evening, she asked, "Mama, do you think they'd ever let me see it?" Lydia laughed softly. "Baby, that's a different world." Amara smiled. "Then I'll build my own." And she meant it. That determination carried her through everything. Through nights when the power was cut off and she coded by flashlight. Through mornings when classmates teased her for dreaming too big. She never snapped back. She just kept going. Because when you've already lost everything once, fear stops being your language. Her talent began to bloom online. Using a borrowed Wi-Fi connection, she joined coding forums under the name Marisky. Her posts were sharp, her logic flawless. People started asking her for advice. Not knowing the person helping them debug million-dollar systems was a teenage girl in a one-bedroom apartment. She never told them. She didn't need credit, she just needed purpose. And maybe that's why, when Halden's company system crashed and the world panicked, she didn't see chaos. She saw a puzzle begging to be solved. It wasn't luck that saved the company that day. It was years of unseen nights, quiet persistence, and a little girl who refused to believe her limits were defined by the walls around her. Behind every miracle there's a story the world almost missed. This was hers, a story not of privilege, but of power born from perseverance. The day after the system was restored, journalists wanted interviews, tech magazines wanted exclusives, and universities sent offers. But Amara didn't rush. She told her mother, "Mama, I'll do it, but only if it means something." Lydia smiled. "Then make it mean something, baby." So, she started to dream again, this time bigger. She wanted to use her gift not just to fix systems, but to fix what society kept breaking: opportunity, equality, and belief. Because what's the point of genius if it doesn't lift others up? That's when the Parker Initiative truly began to take shape. An idea born from the same cracked laptop that had once sparked her curiosity. A foundation for kids like her, the ones nobody noticed, the ones who didn't have fancy schools but had something stronger: hunger. And though her story had reached the world, she still spoke like the girl who came from the South Side. Humble, grounded, grateful. When asked by a reporter what motivated her most, she said simply, "My mama used to say the world doesn't owe us kindness, but we can still give it anyway." And maybe that's what genius truly is, not brilliance in the head, but light in the... They say after every calm comes a storm. And sometimes the storm doesn't come from nature. It comes from people who can't stand to see light in the places they never looked before. For a while, the world seemed kind. The company was running again. The city, once filled with talk of loss, now whispered about hope. And in every corner of the internet, people spoke the name Amara Parker with awe. But fame has a way of bending light, turning admiration into envy, and praise into poison. It began quietly. A few online comments here, a bitter headline there. Did she really fix it herself? Impossible for a kid that age. Publicity stunt? The whispers grew like cracks in glass. Behind polished doors and smiling faces, some of the same people who cheered her on now questioned her worth. In boardrooms, she overheard fragments of conversations. Men in suits debating if she'd had help. One said, "You know how these things go viral. Maybe the story's been exaggerated." Another laughed, "Cute kid, but come on. Saving an entire system?" She didn't confront them. She just listened. And somewhere deep inside, the quiet ache of being unseen returned. The same ache she'd carried since childhood. Because for some, no matter how much you prove yourself, they'll still only see where you came from, not where you stand. Lydia noticed it first. Her daughter's smile had changed, softer, sadder. One evening, she found Amara sitting on their balcony, staring out at the city lights that once felt like stars. "Rough day, baby?" she asked gently. Amara nodded. They don't believe me, Mama. Lydia's voice was calm, steady. They don't have to. You know what you did. Amara's eyes glistened. But it's not fair. Lydia took her hand. It never is. But fairness isn't what makes us. Faith is. A mother's words don't erase pain, but they remind the heart that it still has a home. The storm grew louder. Reporters began demanding proof, interviews, data, statements. Some claimed it was impossible for someone without formal training to fix such a complex system. A few even accused the company of using Amara's story as a diversity distraction. Richard Halden, though loyal, was pressured by investors. In one tense meeting, an executive said, "We need to manage this narrative. The markets don't like uncertainty." Halden snapped, "The only uncertainty here is your faith in talent." But the damage was done. Suspicion had taken root. When Amara arrived at the company one morning, her ID card didn't scan. The security guard, looking uneasy, said, "Sorry, ma'am. I was told to check with HR first." Her hands trembled. I work here." He looked down. Orders are orders. That moment broke something inside her. Not her will, but her trust. Nothing wounds the spirit deeper than being doubted by the world you saved. Lydia stormed into Halden's office that afternoon, fury shaking her voice. "My daughter fixed what none of you could, and now you're locking her out." Halden stood silently, guilt heavy in his eyes. "It's temporary, Lydia. There's pressure, people asking questions." "Then you answer them," she snapped, because she already did her part. He had no reply. That evening, Amara walked through the city streets alone. Hoodie pulled up, tears streaking down her face as raindrops began to fall. She passed glowing billboards showing her own picture. The headlines that once called her the girl who saved the future. Now, the same screens carried new ones. Doubt over miracle fix. Was Amara Parker just lucky? She stopped in front of one and whispered, "Lucky." Then she laughed through her tears. "I built my luck with broken keys." Some storms don't come to destroy. They come to remind the sky how strong it is. The next morning, she decided she wouldn't hide anymore. She opened her laptop, went live on a small stream, no PR, no company, no script. Just her code and the truth. "People keep asking how I did it," she began. "So, I'll show you." For the next hour, she walked viewers through every step. The logic, the code, the errors, the fix. Her fingers danced across the keyboard like music, confidence steady and unshaken. And when she was done, the world finally saw, not just a girl, but a genius forged in quiet perseverance. The clip went viral within hours. Comment sections flooded with apologies, admiration, and awe. And the next morning, headlines changed again. Amara Parker silences doubters, with brilliance live. But she didn't smile in victory. She just exhaled, as if she'd carried the weight of the world and finally put it down. Because truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand long enough to be heard. That night, Lydia held her daughter close. "You proud of yourself, baby?" Amara shook her head softly. "I'm proud of us." And though the storm had tried to break her, it only polished her light, brighter, clearer, unshakable. They say storms test what's real, and Amara Parker was as real as they come. They say history forgets the silent ones. But this time we will remember her. Because her light didn't fade when the world turned away. It only shone brighter. Years passed. The story of Amara Parker became more than a headline. It became a legend whispered in classrooms, tech labs, and late-night conversations between mothers and daughters who dreamed of something more. Halden Technologies grew stronger after the crash, not because of its systems but because of what it learned. Richard Halden himself changed. He opened scholarships in Amara's name, built programs for underrepresented youth, and began hiring from places he'd never thought to look before. Whenever people asked him why, he'd say, "Because brilliance has no uniform." As for Lydia, she never returned to cleaning floors. She became the head of community outreach at the company, running mentorship programs for women who'd once stood where she did. Her quiet grace inspired every room she walked into. She'd often say, "I used to mop these halls. Now I walk them with my head high. Not because the world changed, but because my daughter did." And Amara? Amara became a name that stood for hope. By 21, she had built the Parker Initiative into a nationwide movement, connecting thousands of kids from struggling communities with free technology, mentors, and a chance to dream louder than their circumstances. Everywhere she went, she carried herself the same way, calm, humble, radiant. She never dressed like a prodigy or talked like one. She just was. Because when the world finally hears your silence, you don't need to shout anymore. On a quiet spring morning in New York City, Amara returned to the place where everything began, the glass tower of Halden Technologies. It was her first time back in years. The receptionist didn't recognize her at first, but when she said her name, the woman's eyes widened. "Wait, the Amara Parker?" Amara smiled softly. "Just Amara." She rode the elevator to the top floor, where Halden, now older, slower, but still sharp, was waiting. They talked for hours about technology, legacy, and time. When she stood to leave, he said, "I used to think power meant control, but you taught me it means care." Amara nodded gently. "And care," she said, "is what keeps systems and people alive." As she left the building, she saw her reflection in the same glass wall where she'd once stood trembling years ago. Back then, she'd been a girl hoping someone would believe in her. Now, she was a woman who had become the proof. They say miracles happen once, but sometimes the miracle becomes a movement. Outside, children were gathered in a nearby park, laptops open, screens glowing. A banner hung above them, the Parker Initiative, building futures, one code at a time. Lydia stood among the crowd, watching her daughter from afar, pride shining in her eyes. When their eyes met, they didn't need words. Because some stories don't end, they echo. And that night, as the city lights flickered on, the same lights that once blinked back to life the day the system was saved, a voice seemed to whisper across the skyline. "They say history forgets the silent ones. But this time we remembered her. We remembered the girl who saw a problem and didn't wait for permission to fix it. We remembered the mother who believed when no one else did. We remembered that greatness isn't born in towers. It rises from the ground, quiet, patient, unstoppable. And if you listen closely, even now, you can still hear her story humming in the code, beating in the hearts she changed, and shining in every soul that dares to dream beyond the limits of their name."